Actor Stephen Tompkinson punched a drunk man to the floor, causing him traumatic brain injuries after he made noise outside the TV star's home, a court has heard. The 57-year-old, best known for starring in ITV drama Wild at Heart and playing the title role in TV crime drama DCI Banks, is accused of attacking Carl Poole on May 30, 2021 outside his home in Whitley Bay. He denies a charge of grievous bodily harm. A jury at Newcastle Crown Court heard how the TV star knocked Poole to the ground, causing him to bang his head and fracture his skull. Poole and another man had been drunk and making a noise outside the home Tompkinson shared with his partner and her child. The TV star called police and went outside to ask them to move on. Mr. Tompkinson says he acted in self-defense and only pushed Mr. Poole after he became aggressive and came towards him. The court was told about 2 calls made to emergency services on the evening of the alleged incident. Prosecutor Michael Bunch said, 2 calls were made to the emergency services between 5:30 and 6 o'clock on the morning of the 30th of May 2021. The first call was from the defendant, contacting police about 2 drunken men outside his address. The second, made just a short time later, came from a neighbor to report one of those 2 men was lying unconscious in the street. What happened between those 2 calls is the question you will have to decide in the course of this trial. The prosecution say the defendant, angry at the noise the 2 men were making, ended up punching one of them, knocking him to the floor so that he banged his head and sustained traumatic brain injuries. The defendant claims he did not more than push away the man in self-defense after the 2 had come towards him. Neighbor Caroline Davidson, lives diagonally across from Tompkinson on Beach Grove in Whitley Bay. She said she had been woken on the Sunday morning by 2 men laughing and carrying on in the street. Mr. Brunch said, she looked out of her upstairs window to see the 2 lying on the path to the left of the defendant's home address. She could see that one of them, Mr. Poole, had on only his underpants, with a towel lying on the path next to him. Mr. Hall had on a t-shirt and shorts. Content that they were simply carrying on. Mrs. Davidson went back to bed. However, around 5 minutes later she was further disturbed, hearing another voice outside. She went back to her bedroom window and again looked out. This time she could see the 2 men had been joined by the defendant, who was standing on his driveway speaking to the 2 men. She recognized the defendant as the man who lived diagonally across the road from her. She had never spoken to him but recognized him as having moved in 2 or 3 years earlier. She couldn't hear what her neighbor was saying, but she formed the view from hand gestures he was making that he was telling them to get on their way. Mr. Bunch added, it appeared one of the men said something back to her neighbor. She saw the neighbor draw back his fist before apparently thinking better of it and lowering his hand. The 2 men, who were clearly heavily drunk, tried to get to their feet. Mr. Poole could hardly stand upright. Mr. Hall had to help him keep his feet. The 2 made their way a short distance before stopping, possibly because the defendant had said something further to them. By now, they were on the footpath at the end of the defendant's driveway. He remained in the middle of the drive. Mrs. Davidson described in her witness statement how Tompkinson first slapped Mr. Poole with his right hand before punching him to the head with his left fist. Mr. Bunch said. Mrs. Davidson watched as the defendant approached the two men, who were wobbling from side to side. The defendant first slapped Mr. Poole with his right hand before punching him to the head with his left fist. Mr. Poole stumbled and then fell backwards, striking his head on the roadway, where he lay unconscious. Concerned for what she had seen, Mrs. Davidson asked her husband to call the ambulance service. The defendant had also called the police at some point during this sequence, it would appear after he first spoke to them, because he told the police he had taken a bottle of Jägermeister from them and wanted them moving on. The court was told how Tompkinson then used his mobile phone to record two separate clips of the two men. Mr. Bunch added, after Mr. Poole had gone to the floor, the defendant used his mobile phone to record two separate clips of the two men. He did not, however, contact the ambulance service himself. When paramedics arrived at the scene, they found Mr. Poole unconscious and he was taken to hospital, where it was discovered he had a number of fractures to his skull, resulting in significant traumatic brain injuries. Police officers later returned to Tompkinson's home and arrested the star. The court was told that when interviewed, Tompkinson had told police he had gone out to ask the two men to move on, so they didn't disturb his partner and her child, who were asleep in the house. Prosecutor Mr. Bunch told the court, he said the men were obviously drunk, with Mr. Poole repeatedly collapsing to the floor. He said the men had turned aggressive and came towards him, so he pushed Mr. Hall away, then raised a hand to keep Mr. Poole away. He turned to look at Mr. Hall, and when he turned back, Mr. Poole had gone to the floor. He denied at any point striking out aggressively at Mr. Poole. The prosecutor added, the Crown say this claim of aggressive behavior on the part of the two men is simply not supported by any other material in the case. Caroline Davidson, who has no axe to grind, describes no such behavior on the part of the pair. The prosecution say the truth is the defendant's story is nothing more than a weak attempt by him to deflect blame onto others for what were his wholly unjustified aggressive actions towards Mr. Poole. The trial continues.